Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Max Payne 2, The Fall of Max Payne, for PC, Xbox, and PlayStation 2. What you're seeing here is the PC version. This is a third-person shooter and the sequel to Max Payne. It was developed by Remedy Entertainment and published by Rockstar in 2003, first for PC and then later on for consoles, and it was generally very well received. Most people seemed to enjoy it quite a lot, and it went on to win a couple of awards for that particular year. But despite the rather solid reviews across the board, and it generally being very well liked, it actually did not sell very well on its launch, and in the years since its release, it's become somewhat forgotten when you compare it to the generally beloved original Max Payne and the very polarizing Max Payne 3. So why might that be? Well, let's go ahead and start delving into this thing and find out what exactly is going on here. Well, before we get into the meat of the game, let's first talk about the presentation, which is a pretty massive step up from the previous game. Not only does it have far superior modeling and animations, but it also has stronger texture work, as well as quite a lot of detail in the environments, and even some physics to go along with it, because this game uses the Havoc physics engine. As a result, you'll see a lot of things go flying all over the place, including ragdolling bodies as you blast them with a shotgun and they go flying across the room and things like that. Hell, they even threw in functioning mirrors in an effect that's still underused to this day. But then you move past simply the visual quality, and then you get into the actual visual style, which is much the same as it was in the previous game. There's a lot of muted colors, although the game does still have quite a bit of color in it. It's just trying to go for that sort of gritty film noir feel, only it does it to a much lesser degree than the previous game. Another visual effect they changed, or rather added in this case, is that now when you go into bullet time, the entire screen takes on a sepia hue. I'm sure the idea behind that was to make it a more cinematic thing when you go into bullet time, but it didn't really work out as well as they might have hoped. It just ends up being kind of a, oh, that's different, well, time to move on kind of deal. If you're coming into this game from the previous one, you'll also notice that the game relies a lot more on in-game cutscenes as opposed to the graphic novel ones, although the graphic novel cutscenes are still there and in full force. And honestly, they probably could have relied more on the graphic novel style cutscenes, because one of the things you'll notice in the in-game cutscenes is that when people talk, their mouths move like ventriloquist dummies. It's just a feature that ends up making the game look rather dated in hindsight. Of course, at the time, it looked great, but these days, we've got so much higher standards than that it's a bit jarring. But then you move over into sound design and you notice that it is actually a noticeable improvement over the previous game. It does still have some fairly decent weapon and explosion sounds, although they're still not as beefy as I would like. They don't really have that really nice bass kick to them that really makes those kind of sounds great. But compared to most other video game sound effects of that era, they're certainly on the higher end of things. The ambient sounds are very effective, and they actually changed up the soundtrack a bit. It's more pronounced than it was in the previous game, and you'll notice immediately that the game's rendition of the iconic theme from the original game is considerably darker in tone and is more of a sweeping orchestral track. It's very fitting for the game and is an extremely high quality track, and it's also indicative of the quality that you're going to be finding for the rest of the soundtrack, which ranges from orchestral stuff and even a bit of electronic and rock music to go along with the action. It all ends up working very well for the game, and then there's the voice acting, which is a noticeable improvement over the previous game. The voice acting in the original game had an almost amateurish quality to it that gave it a lot of charm, actually, but this one is considerably more professional, and it's obvious they were a lot more comfortable with the production this time around. Now, that says nothing about the actual lines they're saying, but as far as how they're saying them, they have a noticeable improvement over the previous game. And so when you bring all of the presentation together, you have something that's obviously a massive improvement over the original game as far as its raw quality goes. And because it is higher quality, and even for its time it was very high quality, it has aged very gracefully in hindsight. But as well as the presentation holds up, what really matter here are the story and the gameplay. And the game actually starts at the end of the story and then works its way back from there by jumping all over the place in the timeline, which was really not all that great of a way to handle the plot, because it jumps back and forth all over the place between when things were going on in the past and when things are happening now. And as things jump around in the timeline, it helps you piece together what exactly is going on, and by the time you get to the end of the game, the whole thing still makes sense, because it's always made sense, but you now have the full picture and you're like, oh, okay, but why did they tell the story that way? The narrative structure doesn't really suit the game all that well. It probably would have been better suited if they had done what the original game did, which was start at the end, and then it went into the prologue, and then after that it went into the actual main part of the story. That structure fit the first game very well, and I feel like they were trying to shake things up with the sequel to make it very different and still keep things fresh, but ultimately that just didn't work out all that well in the long run. But what about the story itself, independent of the way it's told? Well, it takes place after the events of the original Max Payne, where Max has been basically exonerated of everything that went on in the previous game, and he no longer works undercover, instead having gone back to being a homicide detective. The events of the story get kicked off by a response to a call about gunshots being heard at a warehouse owned by a character from the previous game, Vladimir Lim, who ultimately helped Max to get his revenge. When Max arrives on scene, he finds nobody there except for some cleaners who turn out to be hired goons, and things are complicated when, after fighting his way through several of the cleaners, he runs into the femme fatale hired gun Mona Sachs. This starts to plant more and more questions into Max's brain, and as he's pursuing the cleaners and trying to find out who's behind their interference in his investigations and such, he uncovers that there's a pretty vast conspiracy going on, and he ends up having to go up against it because they've put out a hit on him and he has to fight for his life. Along the way, he becomes incredibly conflicted because he starts to realize he actually has pretty strong feelings for Mona Sachs, and it starts to complicate matters even further, ultimately resulting in, well, the fall of Max Payne, as the title implies. Now, in theory, that makes for a really interesting setup and something that would really work well for a film noir-style story, because those generally are about the darker aspects of the human psyche. In practice, however, everything is rather rushed and not all that well explained until you finally hit the end of the game, and they basically give you an exposition dump as to why things are the way they are. It's a pretty weak way of trying to wrap everything up, and it really does make everything feel extremely rushed as a result. And the really short length of the game doesn't really help that either. This is a single-player only title, and it's maybe 5 hours long, if even that. But that said, it wraps up Max's story. This was clearly supposed to be the end of the Max Payne series. It was clearly supposed to end the way an actual film noir does, where nobody really comes out having won anything. And thus, the ending of Max Payne 2 is very fitting for a film noir saga. It wraps everything up, it completes Max's story, and it does it in a very satisfactory manner. And frankly, if you were hoping for a happy ending, then, well, you don't know anything about film noir. Now that said, there is an alternate ending you can get if you beat the game on the hardest difficulty setting, and that might be more to some people's liking. I'm not going to spoil it for you, and I'm not going to spoil what the actual ending of the game is, but suffice to say, the way they end the Max Payne saga at the end of Max Payne 2 feels like a full-stop ending, and it is a pretty satisfying one at that. Like I said, everything has been wrapped up, all the various story threads have been completely taken care of. And then Rockstar happened. But that's a topic for another video, one that is outside the scope of Max Payne 2. So when you really get down to it, the story is a satisfying conclusion to Max Payne, but it feels very rushed, and there's certain elements of the storytelling that really do drag it down considerably. And it really doesn't help that unless you've played the original game, you're not really going to get much out of the characters in this, because they're basically just continuations of how they were in the first game, and they don't really develop all that much over the course of the game. Not to mention the fact that this is a very watered-down version of the film noir aesthetic that we had in the first game, where Max doesn't even really have poetic explanations of things all that much at all throughout the course of the game. Most of the time, he just has a very morose manner of narrating things, and that's fine. It's certainly still fitting for film noir, but let's face it, that verbose, overly poetic way of describing things was what gave the first game a lot of its charm. Unlike the first game, which was completely self-aware, they knew exactly what they were doing and they just ran with it, this one feels more like they tried to tone it down to suit a wider audience, and that ultimately just didn't work out all that well. Even though there are a few dream sequences in this game, there aren't as many fourth wall breaks. In fact, I don't remember there ever really being a fourth wall break. Although the game's certainly not without a sense of humor. It does still have that, and you will still notice moments here and there where something outright silly just happens. But generally speaking, they have toned it down considerably from what you saw in the first game, and it's just not as memorable in the long run. And really that's the biggest problem the game has. Even though it does tell a decent enough story that does conclude Max Payne's story, it doesn't have anywhere near the same amount of charm that the first game did, and while the first game wore all of its influences on its sleeve and ran with it, this one ultimately gets mired more in the Hollywood crime thriller than in an actual film noir, and that just ends up giving it less style. Now that said, there is one thing that is undeniable about Max Payne 2 compared to the first game, and that is that they have significantly improved the gameplay mechanics. If you've played the original Max Payne, this is going to be a very easy transition for you, but for those of you who haven't played Max Payne, know that there is a delay between when you shoot and when your bullet actually hits something. It's a projectile instead of a hit scan weapon. A hit scan weapon is when you press the button to shoot the weapon and it instantly hits whatever it's supposed to be aiming at. And while Max Payne 2 does use the same projectile system that the first game did, they sped up all of the projectiles so that when you're just running around shooting stuff without the bullet time on, things are moving very quickly. When you do turn bullet time on, you'll find that in addition to making the world move in slow motion, you actually move quicker than everybody else, unlike in the first game where the slow-mo made you move slower as well. Whenever you reload in bullet time, you'll also notice that you reload extremely quickly, almost instantly in fact, and you do this kind of spin maneuver whenever you do that. The idea there, I guess, being that in Max Payne 1, bullet time was really handy, but it was more for showing off things, whereas in Max Payne 2, it's a mechanic that makes you more powerful. It ends up actually working a bit better than the bullet time in the original game did, and that's partly because they balanced the difficulty a lot better in this one. It's still a challenging game, but if you're not playing on the hardest difficulty setting, it's not just going to constantly stomp on you like the first game did. You see, I unfortunately forgot to mention this in my original Max Payne review, but the original Max Payne actually had adaptive difficulty, where you would start the game, and then as you played it, it would just take your skills into account, how quickly you were able to dispatch enemies, how much health you were losing, that sort of thing, and then it would kind of tailor the difficulty to your needs. The problem with that was that they designed it in such a way that if you were too good at the game, then it would become practically impossible, and you just had to end up dying over and over and over again until the difficulty readjusted itself to be playable again. That doesn't really happen with Max Payne 2. It has a pretty consistent difficulty curve that starts off actually very easy and works its way up to more and more difficult as you play through the game. As your capabilities increase, so too do the enemies, and you'll find that the enemies you're fighting at the end of the game will be able to annihilate you relatively quickly unless you play smart. It ends up being a challenging but ultimately relatively fair experience, except in some instances where the game is outright unfair. It'll do things like blindside you with an enemy you couldn't have possibly seen coming, or an enemy will be able to hit you from an angle that's pretty much impossible for you to hit them back at, or they'll target the character you're escorting in a mission that I'm pretty sure was designed by Satan. But I'll get to that in a moment. As far as the actual combat goes, the difficulty is reasonably balanced for the most part, and they also introduce, in addition to the changes to bullet time, the ability to have a secondary attack. This can either be throwing grenades or Molotovs, or using a melee attack. I would recommend you never use the melee attack under any circumstances because it's a good way to just get annihilated. The grenades on the Molotovs, on the other hand, are actually very viable. You can just hit the secondary fire button and you'll actually toss one wherever you're trying to aim, and that's a considerably better way of handling it than how you had to do in the first game, which was scroll through your inventory, select them as the primary weapon, and then throw them. And of course, this being a sequel, you would expect it to have more weaponry than the first game, and it certainly does. They do change the jackhammer to a striker, but other than that, you're dealing with pretty much the same arsenal that you had in the first game, with some additions, like for example an AK-47, or the ability to now dual-wield Desert Eagles as opposed to only being able to have one. And generally speaking, all of them are quite satisfying to use. You'll never really run out of ammo because enemies aren't really bullet sponges in this until you run into enemies that have armor vests, and when you're fighting them, you will notice that there's no blood spurts when you're shooting them in the torso. That's because they have armor. If you aim for the head, then they'll still go down almost instantly, so it's got location-based damage, which of course the first game did too, but this one actually works quite a bit better than the first game did. On top of all of that, they made some changes to the way you can do shoot dodges, because now when you dive, you can actually still lay on the ground and keep shooting instead of having to get up immediately, leaving yourself vulnerable. It's a pretty handy change because you'd run into that on occasion in the first game, where you'd do a shoot dodge and then you'd immediately get up and your enemies would still be shooting at you if you didn't manage to take them out instantly. So if you were able to lay on the ground and keep shooting at them, then that would actually be better. And kudos to Remedy for putting in that improvement as well as the other improvements they made to the game. But that said, it's not without its problems. There are several segments of the game where you'll have an AI character tagging along with you, or sometimes multiple AI characters, and the pathfinding is really not all that great in this game. I mean, to give you a prime example, there's that escort mission that I said was probably designed by Satan, and, well, just look at it and you'll see why. Yeah, I don't think I need to say anything more on that one, but suffice to say, the pathfinding can be an issue for the allied characters, and for enemies it can also be a bit of an issue because a lot of the times they'll just funnel right into a kill zone with incredible stupidity. And then sometimes the level design becomes a bit of a problem. This is a very linear game, don't get me wrong, but there are certain levels that are designed in a way to be a bit ambiguous as to where you're supposed to go next, because they want to give you some degree of exploration or to find secret weapons and things like that. But then sometimes they'll design a level in such a way as to make the obvious route not the way you're actually supposed to go, and you have to go on what seems like a side route to get to maybe a secret room or something, and it turns out that's just the way you're supposed to go anyway, so that can be a bit confusing sometimes, although it never really lasts more than maybe a minute or two, because it's pretty easy to get yourself reoriented. Although, let's face it, hiding the way you're supposed to go behind a door that you just opened and is now blocking your view of where you're supposed to go is really not a good move. But for the most part, they've done a good job with it, and generally speaking, in terms of gameplay, this is outright better than the first game. It's just that when you combine that with the weaker narrative, and especially the weaker storytelling than the first game, as well as the general lack of memorable moments throughout the course of the storyline, and the general lack of charm compared to the first game, as well as the AI issues and the level design issues, you end up with a game that's still definitely good, but it's nowhere near as good as the original Max Payne. Like I said, the gameplay mechanics are better, and that along with the fact that it brings a pretty satisfying end to Max Payne's story makes it ultimately worth playing, but only if you have played the first Max Payne. If you liked the first Max Payne, then you'll definitely like Max Payne 2, but unfortunately those are the only people I can really recommend it to. It's still a good game, it's still a good third-person shooter, but that's just it. It's just good. It's not great. The original Max Payne, on the other hand, is absolutely fantastic. And that just makes Max Payne 2 a bit of a disappointment. Again, still a good game, still well worth playing, but only after you've played the first game. And that ultimately makes it a 3.5 out of 5. Thanks for watching.